And the other two had come to that conclusion having had a negative experience with come one, come all coalitions where everyone was in the room. The second lesson is an argument about what it is to be a successful coalition. And I argue that a successful coalition is not simply one that wins social change. As nice and as important as that is, that if we just measure our success based on achieving social change, then we're being really instrumental about what it takes to build progressive power. But I argue that as well as social change, coalitions should be measured and can be measured on the extent to which they build organisations. Because if social change is achieved at the cost of the power and capacity of our organisations, then the engine room by which we sustain progressive change over time is being undermined. But I found in most coalitions, indeed in all coalitions, these two operate in tension. And that sometimes coalitions, well always, coalitions make strategic decisions to focus on social change and organisational strength at different times. And so, for instance, with the Sydney Alliance, while we're spending 3 years building the organisational strength before we start working on specific issues, because we know that once we start working on issues, that our organisational strength can be compromised, and we want to build a hub of power first before we start working on issues. But social change can also be understood to be more complex, right? It is about wins. You know, policy victory here, moving an employer there, and that's important. But as we saw in Chicago, you can also win even if you lose. They lost the living wage ordinance, but they shifted the political climate. And that was a huge victory as well. In Ontario, they haven't stopped public-private partnerships. They've slowed it down. But they have built an awareness around a stalwart awareness around the importance of public health care that has ensured that Medicare is secure, and that, you know, that whole idea of public health care is not going to slip the same way it has fallen in the United States. Shifting of famous political climate is critical. Even in Australia, where the relationships fell away between the organisations after time, the salaries campaign that the union did run between 2003 and 2004 was vastly more successful. Massively, they got a 13% pay increase compared to peanuts in the 1990s because of the broad-based campaign work that they've done previously. The political climate is incredibly important. It has to be understood to be a measurable component of coalition work. Organisational strength, I mean two things in particular. I mean sustaining relationships between organisations. So coalitions that are instrumental, you know, rent-a-collar is a phrase that I've heard a lot in the United States, where, you know, union has a picket and they really like someone to come along, a religious leader to come along and support them, so they ask them to come along. That's just not the kind of relationship that's going to sustain for the long term. And there's a real limitation to one-sided coalitions where unions call the shots or community organisations call the shots, and there's not a mutuality within the partnership. Sustaining the relationships, having reciprocity between the partnerships, handing over a little control so control is shared and power can be shared and issues can be negotiated is real power. In Chicago, the USCW was not capable of coming up with a campaign on its own that could win popular support against Walmart. It was the community organisations that did. And then being in a joint relationship with them enabled them to come up with such a creative campaign. They just weren't doing it on their own. But it's also about leadership development. And leadership development of organisation membership. Very few organisations have too many volunteers. We need to build the movement. Coalitions need to be responsible for building the movement. I found that the multi-scale structure of coalitions in Ontario was a great vehicle for that. Training and development is a great vehicle for that. But this is the hardest part of a coalition to build. And it was the thing that was most readily sacrificed in all the coalitions that I looked at. And then the final lesson is one about how organisations work together. And it's, I think, particularly relevant for unions, but it's as relevant for community or religious organisations as it is anything else, which relates to that idea of those instrumental relationships where you come and do a favour for me, or it's a sort of quid pro quo relationship, compared to a more reciprocal relationship. And I've found repeatedly that when organisations work together with a commitment to building power with each other, rather than just using people for their own ends, that the coalition, the result, was a far more powerful coalition. And repeatedly I saw examples of both. So the Teachers Federation did, in part, work with the parents when they were running that salaries campaign in 2003 and 2004. But they did not have the political punch to move the state government that they had when they were running the Vincent Inquiry. It was something that they were working ad hocly with parents, but it wasn't nearly as powerful as when they were at the same table negotiating and sharing an agenda. Same in Chicago, when the union was calling the shots about the strategy, and it was a no Walmart campaign, there was some impact by the fact that the Grassroots Collaborative were there with their large membership base amongst African American or Latino residents. But it wasn't nearly as powerful as when they worked together on the Living Wage Ordinance, and the union opened up the space and ensured that there could be more collegiality in the way in which issues were worked on. And it's incredibly important for organisations to think differently about their own interests and issues, which is part of what it takes to build power. I think from a union perspective, for instance, about the 8-hour day, which feels like it's long gone. But if we're going to win an 8-hour day these days, we can't win it through collective bargaining, because people spend hours in their cars commuting to and from work. In Sydney, commuting times are several hours a day for many people. If we're going to win an 8-hour day, we need to be able to have a public policy agenda around how people get around the city, as well as how people actually live and then work in their jobs. And it's an invitation for unions, for instance, to think much more creatively about how they're going to tackle some of the problems that people are facing. And similarly for religious organisations and community organisations, there's a challenge to what extent are they going to be relevant to the people who sit in the pews or in the activist meetings when those big issues are not being able to be responded to by individual organisations. Who's going to be able to fix those major problems for the city? And so we've applied these lessons in the Sydney Alliance. We've done it, we've built the Alliance very long term. We haven't started working on issues even though we started building in 2007. We decided to go broad, and so therefore we had to go long term. But we didn't just invite every single organisation under the sun to the table. We decided to be quite strategic about the partnerships we wanted to build. And we identified organisations that had a membership base, that had a history, that had a leadership that was open-minded to working differently with other organisations, that knew that they couldn't win change on their own and wanted to work in partnership. And we went out and built relationships with them. So we still use the principle of less is more. We were quite strategic about the partnerships, but we wanted to be diverse, so we made sure we put time into it. We insisted that organisations put their money where their mouth is, and we asked them to make a financial commitment. And through our organising, we've always asked organisations to make a financial commitment. In 2007, we raised $130,000 from 13 organisations. In 2008, end of 2008, we've raised $1 million for 3 years of organising, and we've now got 28 partners who've raised an additional $50,000 for the organising. And that's been essential, because you can't build these things on hope. You have to build them with resources, and making those financial commitments is about committing to making this happen, to prioritising it inside of our organisations. Similarly, we've built a multi-scale structure. We work in Sydney, across the city with our organisations, and we've divided Sydney into 3 regions, and we work locally in districts. So church members and union members and community organisation members can connect with each other in different regions across the city, as well as operating across the scale of the city. Which means that it's not just about leaders coming together and nodding to each other, which is often a weakness of coalitions. We've got connections at every level of our organisation, and we're trying to cultivate that even more. And also, and I guess finally, and I certainly found this in the coalitions, in Chicago and Toronto, there were staff coordinators. And that was an incredibly important reason why those relationships were sustained. The staff coordinators were the bridge builders who helped to mitigate tension when things got hot. They provided resourcing and sustenance to the organisations when things got boring and the power building had to move. We too have paid staff. Most of the money we've raised has been used to employ staff. It started off with 2 of us working part-time, and now we've got 5 staff. You don't need 1 million staff. Sort of less is more there too. You want to be able to have leaders from your organisation be leaders in the coalition. And if you have too many staff, you won't do that. But you do need enough staff to be able to balance out the bridge building and to resource the organising, and I found that to be incredibly important. So, my thoughts for the discussion, I guess, I wonder to the extent, for all of you here, to the extent you've been a part of successful coalitions or you've had challenges in your experience in coalitions, whether any of these lessons applied, or didn't apply. And I'd be particularly interested in hearing and discussing the extent to which these lessons ring true or challenge you or disconnect with your own experience. But certainly I've found, as having done this research and then returned to organising, that many of these lessons have been very, very valuable when it comes to building the powerful coalitions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda.